Stillwater didn't carry the weight of time kindly. Dust blanketed everything that stood still long enough: fences, forgotten wagons, people. The wind was a whisper and a witness, brushing against the cracked clapboards of buildings that once held life. In the soft decay of the town's heart, Jedediah Cain sat alone on the porch of the old saloon, legs outstretched, a tin cup in his hand that held more silence than whiskey. His coat was worn, the leather cracking near the elbows, and the brim of his hat sagged just enough to hide the regret that had taken up residence in his eyes. People passed him sometimes, mostly travelers, never locals. The townsfolk had grown up and grown away, and the ones who stayed didn't speak to Jed. Maybe they feared the old lawman had ghosts in his blood. Maybe they'd forgotten who he was. Or maybe they just couldn't bear to look too long at a man time hadn't beaten but hollowed out. Jed didn't mind. Talking took energy, and memory hurt more than arthritis ever would. One hot afternoon, when the sky hung white with heat and the ground cracked beneath boot steps, a boy appeared on the road, dragging a broken wheelbarrow with a stubborn wheel and more determination than sense. He was skinny, sunburned, and barefoot, his straw hat swallowing half his face. "Sir," he said, voice a bit cracked from thirst, "you the law?" Jed tilted his head slightly. He didn't move his hand from the tin cup, but his eyes shifted. "Used to be." The boy glanced up the street, then back to Jed. "My ma said to ask you. The fence is busted. Coyotes came in last night and got 2 of our goats. She ain't one to beg, but she don't know who else to ask." Jed didn't answer. He looked at the boy, then past him, toward the horizon. He hadn't walked that far in years. "Ma said your hands still know how to work, even if your mouth forgot how to talk." The boy's words weren't disrespectful. Just honest. And honest had always sat better with Jed than pity. He placed the tin cup down gently beside the rocking chair. The Colt .45 hung on the saloon post behind him, untouched in years. He stood slowly, each joint protesting. He didn't say he'd help. He just reached for the revolver and strapped it to his hip, as naturally as a man might tie his boots. "You comin', mister?" the boy asked. Jed only nodded. They walked in silence along the dusty road, the sun pressing down like a judgment. As the town faded behind them, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke. The boy's name was Eli. Said his ma was named Harper, but folks called her the widow. Her husband had been killed 2 winters back by rustlers. They'd tried to scare her off the land, but she held firm. People in town said she was tough, proud. That pride had cost her comfort, and maybe even kindness. The homestead stood alone, wood dried to gray under the brutal sun. The fence surrounding the goat pen sagged, splintered and patched with whatever she'd found: barrel lids, coat hangers, bits of old bed springs. The goats huddled near the shed, eyes wide and skittish. The widow Harper emerged from the cabin with a shotgun resting casual-like in her arms. She wasn't young, but she held herself tall. Her dress was clean but faded, and her eyes watched Jed like a hawk circling an unfamiliar shadow. "You didn't have to come," she said. "We'll figure it out." Jed studied the broken fence. Not pity. Just work. That was all he said. He picked up a hammer from a stump nearby and began pulling out bent nails. Eli fetched planks, what few they had, and helped align the posts. The boy didn't talk much either, but when he did, it was with a kind of raw hope, like he still believed people could be good, even if the world wasn't. The widow stood in the doorway for a long time before finally stepping back inside. Jed worked until his back screamed, until the sun dipped low and turned the dry fields to copper. Sweat stained his shirt, and his hands, once steady and brutal in a fight, shook with the weight of the years. But the fence stood straight enough to last a season. He turned to leave. "You ever get tired of waiting to die?" the widow asked, her voice sharp, but not cruel. Jed didn't look at her. Used to think dying was the end. Now I think waiting's worse. She didn't answer. He walked. That night, Jed didn't return to town. Instead, he bedded down near the rocks east of the homestead, wrapped in a thin blanket and staring up at a sky so full of stars it felt like they might fall. The coyotes howled, and he rested his hand on the Colt, not out of fear, but habit. He hadn't fired it in years. Still cleaned it weekly. Sleep came in flashes. Dreams twisted between the past and what never came. He saw the gallows again. Not his own, but the boy they'd hung too fast, Tommy Ray, only 17, scared and dumb. Jed had believed he was guilty. Had stood firm in his conviction. But truth came too late, as it often did in these lands. In the morning, the widow brought him coffee in a dented tin mug. "I'm not a skin for a man," she said. "Just someone who remembers what right feels like." Jed stared into the coffee. "I buried that memory a long time ago." "Then dig it up," she replied, without anger. "It ain't dead if you're still breathin'." Trouble found them at noon 2 days later. 3 riders from the south, lean and mean as barbed wire. Dust coated their boots and eyes, and they smiled too wide, like snakes before a strike. Jed watched them ride in from the barn, where he was mending a broken latch. The leader dismounted, spitting tobacco in the dirt. "Heard the widow's gotten herself some company," he said loud enough to echo. Jed didn't reply. Just stepped into the space between the house and the riders. "We ain't here for the goats," the man sneered. "We're here to remind her what happens when a woman forgets her place." Jed's hand moved to his side, fingers grazing the grip of the Colt. "She didn't forget," Jed said quietly. "She just stopped listenin'." The widow was already on the porch, shotgun raised. Her hands didn't shake. The first shot came from her, splintering the silence like a whip crack. One rider fell backward, dead before he hit the ground. Jed moved next, a fluid, brutal draw, his bullet caught the second man in the gut. The third, young and too green for gunfire, turned tail and rode hard, blood trailing from a graze on his arm. The desert fell silent again, but now it held the weight of blood. Eli had hidden behind the porch. He stepped out, eyes wide, staring at the bodies. "You shoot men?" he asked, voice breaking. Jed holstered the Colt slowly. "Only when I have to." They buried the 2 men just past the fence line. The widow dug with him, sleeves rolled, sweat and dirt smearing her cheek. She didn't ask who they were. She didn't care. "You move fast for an old man," she said, half teasing. "I've been still too long," Jed replied. Later, as she cleaned a cut on his hand, she spoke without looking at him. "You ever think maybe you weren't meant to fade out? I thought I was done." "You thought wrong." A few days later, Jed rode into town on a borrowed mule. People stared as he passed. Some looked away. Others, the old ones, nodded. He didn't speak. Just went to the saloon. Stepped behind the counter where the floorboard creaked different than the rest. Pulled it up. The badge was still there. Dust-covered, dull. He wiped it on his sleeve and pinned it to his chest. Not a declaration. Not a boast. Just a quiet return. Old Sheriff Nolan stood in the corner, gray-bearded and long retired. "You gonna start hangin' folks again?" he asked. "No," Jed said. "Just remind 'em that law ain't about killin'. It's about standin' between what is and what shouldn't be." Back at the homestead, things changed slowly. The goats grazed a little further from the shed. Eli smiled more. Jed sat outside some evenings, helping the boy sharpen tools, telling him how to spot coyote tracks, how to read the wind. Not much talk, but what little was said mattered. The widow still carried the same fire in her, but now, when Jed was near, the lines in her face softened. They didn't share sorrow. They shared understanding. One night, as fire crackled and stars blanketed the sky, Eli asked, "You stayin', mister?" Jed looked at the boy, then at the widow, then up toward the stars that had watched him his whole life. "For a while," he said. She passed him a bowl of beans. Her fingers brushed his, and she didn't pull away. There was no music. No grand moment. Just a fire, a quiet family forged not by blood, but by pain, and a man who had finally stopped waiting to die, because he had started living again, in the only way that mattered. With dignity.